I'm very struck, particularly listening to the last presenter, about this term. I mean, when I teach my comparative politics course every year, at some stage or another I have to have a discussion about referendums in Europe, and the question of direct democracy comes up. And perhaps it was discussed earlier on, but when do we call direct democracy is a question I've never had satisfactorily answered. You know, so we have this, you have this fascinating institute of initiatives and referendums. And so we have this question, is it a referendum and that's enough? Or is it a referendum that's initiated in some way or another by citizens? Is it an abrogative referendum where you can only delete clauses? Or is it a referendum to completely rewrite legislation? Or are we talking about other kinds of citizen initiatives, which was also in your remarks about citizens being able to put items onto the political agenda that might or might not go to referendums eventually? So there's that sort of, to be honest, confusion in my own mind about at what point are we actually, you know, what is this beast direct democracy? At what point do we know we have it in our hands? This is what it is. And then one other thing, because Gavin asked me to say a few remarks, particularly for people who may not be here from Ireland, about the recent experience in Ireland of the Irish Constitutional Convention. Because one of the interesting features about referendums, of course, is that they generally are seen as top-down, initiated by the government, or in some way or another bottom-up, initiated by petition of citizens or something. And the Constitutional Convention is a very imperfect, I stress that word, version of a sort of middle ground, a third way, which is where a process is established by the government from the top down, but is promptly given to citizens, for citizens, a random selection of ordinary citizens, to deliberate, become informed about particular issues and come forward with recommendations. And obviously, some of you will know the best real-world example of that process in operation was in British Columbia in 2003, 2004, where in the province of British Columbia, a citizens' assembly was established by the Premier and was told, you're going to decide on whether we're going to change our electoral system, and if you propose a new electoral system, it will go straight to the citizens in a vote, unmediated by the politicians. Now, unfortunately, it didn't pass, but that's a scale eller, another story. But nevertheless, that was a wonderful example, I think, of this sort of third way. And we came sort of close to this, but I can imagine a few people are going to jump at me for saying this, for daring to say it, in the fact that the marriage equality referendum happened at all. Because I would hazard the argument that a socially conservative Taoiseach like our own wouldn't have called a referendum on marriage equality, but for the storm that blew up over the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention. So in a sense, while it didn't have a direct unmediated role in setting the agenda for the referendum, it did play a crucial role in that regard. So that's just a few introductory remarks, but as I said, I'm conscious that you've heard a lot all afternoon, and maybe you want to ask questions of any of our presenters.
I'm going around with the mic, so yes.
Just a couple of comments. On the one hand, with transnational referendum, it's obvious that because direct democracy is not that popular in all the states of Europe, it would seem that that's the reason why the ECI can't get that much traction. So if we work on establishing direct democracy in all the countries of Europe, then I think it would be easy for Europe as a transnational body to have direct democracy. And on the other hand, if let's say the TTIP passes, and for me it's sort of how would the like, for example, let's say we were able to establish a transnational referendum, which would help the ordinary person express their sovereignty and possibly initiate law that could become, transnational law. And if the TTIP passes, in a sense, what would be more powerful? Would the TTIP always overrule transnational referendum, or would transnational referendum have an ability to overrule the TTIP in the future? What do you think? I am me. No. My name is Jan. I'm passionate about direct democracy. I was a co-founder of Direct Democracy Ireland. I'm a co-founder or a founder member of Democracy International. I was a speaker at the first World Conference on Direct Democracy and represented Ireland at that conference. And I'm really passionate about our individual sovereignty and how to express that. And I believe in democracy, and especially direct democracy.
Great answer. Thank you. So, from the mic to you, I guess.
I mean, when we ask what is direct democracy, it reminds me sometimes about the question, what is the midnight sun? I mean, I've experienced people coming up to Sweden and looking for the midnight sun, and they come back and they say it's the same sun as we see all the time. And it's like, I mean, direct democracy is not a different democracy than any other democracy. It's just a feature of a modern democracy, which includes people to have a say on issues. I mean, everybody says democracy, a modern democracy needs, of course, elections on people through the delegation principle. But obviously, a real democracy also cannot be limited to that, because, I mean, it's the most paradoxical argument to say people are smart enough to make a decision between very complex political programs and candidates, and suddenly when it comes to an individual issue, they are too stupid. Then they would be, of course, too stupid to elect these representatives as well. So in that way, direct democracy, you can quite easily define it as it's the right of citizen to put an issue on the agenda through the initiative process and to be able to vote on it in a decisive manner. As we can be a candidate for an election and we can vote on elections. So it's not so complicated, but of course the whole setup, the whole context of democracy and direct democracy is very complex, because it has to do with all these different interests, and it has many different dimensions, and Andy also addressed that with the big mosaic of what a democracy is. But when we come to these issues like a transnational European referendum, I mean, this is not at all a crazy idea. It has been raised already by Charles de Gaulle, who said Europe will only be Europe as a political union when the people have had the possibility to vote on it. And we have European elections. Of course, we can have transnational European referendums. It's today much less complicated than it has been to have elections 200 years ago in countries like France. So that's not it's more about what you have said. It's the power struggle. The people in power never voluntarily share power with others. You can ask when you have a discussion about lowering voting age. I mean, here in Ireland, you have had a lot of these debates. People don't easily share power with others. When it comes to migration, when it comes to women's suffrage, whatsoever, you have always to convince, and in the end, you have to be convinced that together and with more democracy, it's a better way than with less. And if we would have a vote on the TTIP, of course, that must be embedded in a system where you cannot just say everything gets lost. This is I mean, in both sides, even those who are against TTIP, many times it's about the policies of fear, that you say when we get TTIP, everything will be bad, everything will be catastrophic, and we will get chemical chicken from the US and whatsoever. I mean, this is what the referendum process, a proper referendum process can produce, is what we have seen in Scotland. It's something more. It's an extension of what we believe, what can be possible. We can learn together and we can make decisions. And the key point in that will be, in the end, those who lose are not the losers, they are also the winners.
Okay, any other questions? Again, just say your name and if you're representing any organisation.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mark McCauley. I'm part of a campaign. It's called the 1 Year Initiative here in Ireland. My question would be around the European Citizens Initiatives, and also the actual what is happening within, say, Switzerland in terms of direct democracy. The point would be is the European Citizens Initiatives, you can put forward an initiative, but it's not legally binding. For instance, if you take TTIP, for example, 3 million votes went ahead and has been rejected. So whilst we're all trying to improve democracy, there would appear to be another fight against democracy as well. Would that be a common thought, I guess? And if it was, is there anything we can do about that?
Who'd like to take that answer?
About that, and that is that I teach European constitutional law, and one of the questions that frequently comes up in relation to European constitutional law is why the Commission is given the right of initiative. And there's a reason for that. It's because member states who are outvoted, and it can happen quite easily, especially if you're a small member state, outvoted in council, or because your representatives are only a small minority in parliament, they have the consolation, at least, of knowing that the legislation that has been proposed at European level has been proposed by a neutral body. In other words, one that's taking into account the interests of the European Union as a whole, which is what the Commission is actually supposed to do. And you need to be careful about short-circuiting that particular process, because what can happen may be that you end up with a proposal, if you like, that is proposed by, is not proposed by anyone representing anyone in your country, and then is adopted by, if you like, by in council and in parliament, with all the representatives from your country voting against it. And I suppose it has to do with the fact that that we have a European identity, of course, as members of the European Union, but we also have a national identity, and it's vitally important to take both of those into account. And it's for exactly that reason that the European Parliament, for instance, doesn't have a right of initiative, or indeed the Council doesn't have a right of initiative, or is actually only able to amend legislation by unanimity, which virtually never happens. So that would be my thought in relation to that. And I think it was thoughts like that that have, if you like, restricted the taking of the kind of initiatives that you're talking about there.
I'll come to you in a second. She wanted to come in as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you brought up there, and it's one of the things that I also noted when Bruno, you were talking and about this notion of direct democracy and transnational or EU referendums being an opportunity for citizens or individuals or people to seek remedies for something that they perceive as a violation, which actually was a way I hadn't thought about it before. So in law, we look at how you can access remedies to try and remedies if something's gone wrong. And normally the route that we rely on in legal terms is to do that through a court. And it's the court that's the constitutional body that has responsibility for remedying something that's gone wrong in terms of whether or not there's been a legislative or executive action that they need to be held to account for. And so one of the things that I would just follow on from what you were saying there in broader constitutional theory and in terms of how the framework of constitutions operate is that you do need to raise up the safeguards overall in order to facilitate that mechanism through. Otherwise, there's perhaps too much power in one avenue rather than it being balanced. But I do think that there is something in that in terms of it. If it's not legally binding and it's not justiciable, you're not able to adjudicate it in the court, then does it leave it, the fact that it's not enforceable, make it an empty remedy in a sense and not effective? So it's something I think that's really important to consider in that respect.
You should never forget that the European Union is based on a treaty and not on a constitution. And originally, it should have been constituted with a constitution between 46 and 49. But this was not possible because too many of the potential founders didn't want to delegate power in a democratic way. They didn't want to establish a transnational level of democracy. And when you don't have a constitution, it's very difficult to have democratic rights, because a treaty is centralized on governments, not citizens, and the European Union was centralized on a treaty for economy and not in politics in general, and it was done only on the elite level and not with the citizens. And I think we should reconsider this, since it was done in a way at a time when most people thought it is not possible to make a constitution. But today it's possible to make a constitution. And this is a big change between now and 46 and 49, and it was already possible in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War. But at that time, nobody, the prime ministers, the governments were not really interested. And that's why I said at the end that we need a people's movement, because what Bruno said, people on power never want to share power. They only are ready to share power when they think they are afraid to lose all the power when they don't share what they have. And that's why we need a people's movement on the European level to transform the treaty-based European Union in a constitution-based European Union. Because then you have a federation with a two-chamber system, and in the second chamber, the states are overrepresented. The idea comes from the United States. And you have a people's chamber. And every law has to be decided in both chambers. And every law with a potential referendum against this law. And when the European people then want to have a referendum, they can have a European referendum. And doing this is today much more easy than, as Bruno said 200 years ago, normal direct democracy in the French Constitution, where it happens for the first time, 1793. And the point is that too many European citizens are already so disappointed by the quality of democracy at home that they never dare to think about establishing democracy on the European level.
I've got 2 questions now lined up, 3 questions lined up. So we'll
How you doing? Joseph Cunningham, Chairman, Director, Democracy Ireland. Mark and a previous speaker there has mentioned that the European People's Initiative, and Mark mentioned 3 million. There is one serious lacking in the EU law, as well as from the Lisbon Treaty, and that is a Bill of Rights on the European level. Now, there's 860 million thereabouts citizens of Europe. Now, which one of those countries, sovereign nations, has a proper Bill of Rights that's equivalent to 860 million people, citizens? Now, if Mark's point and the previous speaker's point of European People's Initiative, if every citizen had a Bill of Rights, that 3 million people signatures would be skyrocketed. Would you agree with that?
Shall I take the other 2 questions so that you will have time to gather? So you were next. Yes, thank you.
Hello, it's Stephen Mulcahy from Reinstate 48 Initiative. Really, I suppose my question is to Bruno here. Sorry, not to Bruno, to Andreas. I'm just reading your submission document here. You talked about that Switzerland had discovered deficits in the context of its D&D, direct democracy system, over the last 15 years. What I'd be really interested to learn is this. You know, we've got a representative system here. You've got a direct democracy system there. Is there any measurement in Switzerland of the people's people in favor of this system of direct democracy? In other words, if there was an initiative tomorrow, you know, let's get rid of all this direct democracy. Let's just go back to representative democracy. It's a lot simpler. What do you think would be the balance, or has there been any measurement of the popularity, if you like, of direct democracy versus representative democracy?
Hi, my name's Seth Tillman. I teach at Maynooth University. It's not quite as plush as here, but we try to do a good job. I guess, Gavin, I want to follow up with something I think you said, but several of the other speakers touched on, which is we have to beware of hegemonic structures. That's what I want to test and probe here. It's directed towards the speaker who came from Scotland. As I remember the Scottish referendum, the elite opinion coming down from the print broadsheets was uniformly directed against the referendum, but so was the BBC. All right. So if the idea is that we need a better informed public, it hardly follows, as I think one of our speakers from Switzerland said, that the government can set up institutions to promote a better decision-making framework. If you give these institutions independence, you never know what they'll do. And if you put them under the thumb of government, well, they'll all go one way. So I don't know that being aware of hegemonic structures is going to help anything with regard to democracy. As far as Ireland, we just had a referendum here, right? I use we casually. I'm not a national. But to tell you the truth, given the overwhelming turnout and the overwhelming result, one really wonders whether you have autonomous decision makers who aren't being oppressed or being directed here because, like you said, the Taoiseach didn't control it, the government didn't, the church didn't. As far as Switzerland, our speaker here from Switzerland on the right takes for granted that it's the proper thing for the dominant parties and the unions and the employers to get together to bribe the working class to make sure that the results of an open referendum aren't upheld and could be changed, as if we're all in natural agreement with that. You're the hegemonic structure, all right? You're it, not something out there. You have no idea whether the people in this room agree with that, but you took for granted that we do. And you consider half your own country just to be some strange right-wingers who don't have views that can be explained. It seems to me that there's a real problem here. There's a real factual disconnect with what we're supposed to be talking about.
That's a good one. Okay. Who wants to start?
The first question, of course, it's easy. When you would have a vote, you know, it's like in California. The process is always in debate, and there are always critics, and many people know that it's not functioning perfectly. But when you would ask in California or in Switzerland, do you want to get rid of direct democracy? 95% of those who vote would say no. Everybody likes it. Some politicians, they don't like it, but they don't say that they don't like it because they know that they would make themselves very unpopular. But on the other hand, to improve it, the will to improve it, this is not the same. And that's why I said the fact that it was not improved in the last 100 years when it comes to the context factors shows that some people of the elite still would like to get rid of it, but they know that it's not possible. So that's the fact. And nobody wants to nobody would allow anybody to take away his citizens' rights. And your question is not so, sounds perhaps good, but it's not very accurate. Because what the BBC has done towards the Scottish referendum would be impossible in every other public service. In Switzerland or in Germany, the public service has not the right to take sides. They have to produce discussions, they have to produce different comments, but never ever they would have the right to take sides. You can even say that in Switzerland they are going on the other direction. They're going away of politics. They don't do the service anymore. They need to inform the people on the different options and on the different consequences. But you can also do it another way. The Danes, for instance, when they make referendums on the European level or others, they sometimes make in an own law, they decide that both sides get a sum of money to use for public information and public debate. This is much more fair than leave it to nobody, so that those who are rich, they have a lot, many resources, and those who are not, they have nothing. You can't hear them, because the point is you need money to get heard, to organize debates, to make public advertisement and so on. And in Switzerland, TV advertisement is not allowed politically. That's also very important, because that's the most money-consuming element in the American campaigns. So I think the Swiss government could do much more in the sense of enabling the people to have to be heard. That's the point. And today we don't have this in a equal, in a fair way. For instance, there is a famous example out of the U.S. story. In California, you had at the end of the 60s and end of the 70s, the private TV company owners were ready to take 10% of any spending for one side to produce ads for the other side. That was a good idea. But then the Constitutional Court, on the demand of one of the money givers, said no, because he protected the money giver, the spender for one side, that he should not be forced to take 10% to the other side. But such an agreement between the TV people, that would have been a step in the right direction we should think about.
Do you want to
I just want to address again, it has been said by you that, I mean, here is a representative democracy, in Switzerland is direct democracy. It's just not true. I mean, you have direct democratic elements in your constitution, obviously, 39 national votes, which creates debates about issues where people can have a say on an issue. And in Switzerland, I mean, direct democracy is a feature, but I mean, most decisions are made exactly like here by delegates, by Congress, by Parliament. Just very few issues are taken from Parliament to the people by a referendum. The important thing is that you have always the right to do it. You know, it's a process. That is why direct democracy, proper direct democracy, makes representative democracy much more representative and not less. And we should avoid to be in this black and white idea of a referendum is like an opinion poll. You have no idea who is participating. It's the process which is critical towards a vote. The vote is only the final point. It's the technical mean of making a decision. Of course, you need it. But what's going before? Therefore, I think the Scottish experience is so great, because, of course, you have a winner and a loser, but in the end, you have even those who have made all this experience by being heard in between elections, feeling much, much better and much more encouraged to be active citizens. And that is what we need for all these issues. We need people who are not just saying you are responsible, people who take responsibility. That's the way to do it. And for this reason, we need a more representative democracy by having stronger direct democratic features.
Thank you. There's 4 questions lined up already, so did you say you wanted to?
Yeah, I'll just come back to us on the Scottish
So
question.
just ask the speakers just to respond to issues that haven't already been raised, perhaps,
Okay.
that you feel you have wanting to add to.
Just on the point of whether or not there's a right to a referendum, is that in terms of of EU law? There is a right to vote, but it extends only to. Yeah. Yeah. There is a charter of fundamental rights at the EU level. I agree with you. It's not it's not a full one, but there is international human rights law which does extend. Yeah, I'm not actually disagreeing with you. I'm just to let you know that there is an international human rights framework which does provide for wider participation in referendums and direct democracy. So it might be helpful to refer to that international framework when arguing for an extension to EU law. And just on the point, I absolutely agree with you. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, Seth. On the point of this sort of self-perpetuating hegemonic structure in relation to referendums, and one of the things that I was drawing out in relation to the process legitimising the outcome is that, you know, there has to be this principle of inclusiveness, and inclusiveness is a very difficult thing to identify and also to define. And one of the major problems was that the BBC believed and certainly sent out the message that they thought they were being impartial and giving both sides a fair point of view. But actually what happened in Scotland, in quite unique circumstances, is that every time a sort of elite-driven piece of information was delivered in that manner, which might have perpetuated self-existing powers structures, Scottish people tended to react by the yes vote increasing. So there was an awareness that there was different levels of power and control, but I think it's one of the things that often gets overlooked in constitutional transitional process is the idea of inclusivity, and how do you achieve it? How do you include groups that are marginalised and don't have access to a decision-making process in a majoritarian political structure? And that is one of the big issues with it. And in the Scottish context, in terms of process, there were definitely mechanisms that allowed for inclusivity and participation, but I think you're right to raise the questions that there is a self-perpetuating power structure that has to be addressed as well.
I'll come to you in a second, Ronan. Gavin, did you?
Yeah, just very quickly in relation to the Bill of Rights thing, I suppose that's to the extent it's already been addressed in the sense that we do have a Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. I don't agree that it's valueless. It's been used, for instance, to strike down asset freezing measures that were adopted by the European Union in the Cadi case. It was also used at the initiative, incidentally, of a lecturer in this university, in the law school, to strike down legislation on data retention, and the safe harbour decision that was recently reached was also done on the basis of it. The Charter of Fundamental Rights applies in the context of the application of European Union law and the competences of the European Union outside that particular competence, where incidentally you are also protected by general principles, and you're also protected by the indirect application of the European Convention on Human Rights in the form of general principles. And within the scope of national law, you're of course protected by the fundamental rights in the Irish Constitution, which are quite comprehensive as well. So there's fairly comprehensive protection in relation to fundamental rights. In relation to hegemonic structures, here I go, I'm going to commit blasphemy here, but I did note hegemonic, if you like, that the provisions are pro-hegemonic. I didn't say I disapproved of that. The hegemony in question is the hegemony of the democratically elected Irish government. And I do have worries, personally, about direct democracy in some respects. I worry about the hegemony of private money in referendums at times. I worry about the hegemony of those who would infringe upon fundamental rights, and I have one or two Swiss referendums in mind in relation to that, and I think you know which ones I'm talking about. It may be that there are systems of protecting, if you like, in referendum situations. We've heard some suggestions in those regards earlier on, but I'm not entirely against the notion that referendums in Ireland should be put through the Oireachtas first before they're. Now I know there are plenty who would disagree in that regard, but that's just maybe a point that I'd make in that regard.
The comment to Sam, of course, I don't share a romantic vision of democracy, but this is not a reason to adopt a cynical vision of democracy instead. What I mean by that is interest politics is about power, and there is always an interest intermediation process which is implied by democratic decision making. It's about finding a way to come up with a solution, and finding a solution through direct democratic means, as in the cases that I discussed, did not change interest politics or abolish interest politics, but it made the range of those involved in interest politics greater. So in one sense, you could say, yes, there's always the danger of corruption in politics, but it costs more to corrupt an entire people than to corrupt one single dictator.
Okay, I've got 4 questions now, so we're going to take them all together.
Hi there, George Flood is my name. I'm with Direct Democracy Ireland as well. And my question to you is, do you think that democracy is dead in Ireland? And I tell you why. Is that we talk about citizens' initiative referenda, we talk about referenda coming down from government and all that. We had 2 referendas here in Ireland. One was called the Nice referendum. The people rejected the first time. They were right back to the polls 2 years, 3 years later to vote again. We had the Lisbon referendum. People rejected it. We right back to the polls and asked to vote again. The Lisbon Treaty was put through the French people. They rejected it. The Dutch people, they rejected it. So my question is direct democracy actually dead?
Chew on that one for a bit now, folks.
Hi, my name's Luke Dunn. I'm involved with the 1 Year Initiative as well. It's just a statement more than really a question. I've listened to everybody today and about direct democracy. But a part of the 1 Year Initiative, one of the main things was a People's Assembly. It's more or less like a convention with real power to sort of devise a mechanism completely divorced from government. So my question, I suppose, would be, do the speakers believe that we could, as a people, as a convention, could we devise the mechanisms and how it would work and bring it to the people and let them decide on it themselves instead of always being dictated to by government? Of what government should think direct democracy is, and instead we could bring the idea of what we think direct democracy should be.
Thanks very much. Prunchius de Rossa, I'm an ex-MEP. And I was just counting recently. I participated in 13 referendums. So you know, and I won some and lost some, and was for some and against others, and so on. I'm of the view that we have to be very cautious about the extension of national referendums on EU issues, on adopting EU treaties. I think the European Union is already progressing at a very, very, very slow pace. And in fact, I could argue that it's going backwards at the moment. If we're going to get the kind of federal Europe which I think is necessary, which would deepen democracy, then we have to find a better way of getting agreement. And I think participative democracy is one way of doing that. And the form that would take is something which I think has to be thought about very, very, very deeply. I have to say, I mean, as a former politician, I'm no longer, I don't stand for an election anymore, and so on. But I think, like this chap over here talked about being dictated to by the government. The government is the people we elect. Elections are about sharing power, about who we decide are going to exercise power on our behalf for the next 5 years. And so we as a body select them. It's not that we have to take everything lying down. I'm simply saying that it's wrong to describe them as dictators. They're not. They've been elected on a program. What's lacking is the capacity of citizens, or the mechanism for citizens to engage in a real way with the government once they're elected, and with the parliament. And there's certainly in Ireland, a serious need for parliamentary reform, which gives more power to all of the TDs in the Dáil, and indeed with the Senate as well. So I think we have to modify our language and our thinking about politics if we're going to make progress in developing participative democracy, because simply describing government as dictators is simply to write them off and to write off democracy. And if we do that, we're up the creek.
One last question.
Thanks. I'd just like to first comment on... Oh, sorry, my name is Vanessa Liston from Civic. I'd just like to respond first, just to say that raises an interesting question that was raised in Kilkenny in the controversy there on the Central Access Scheme, which was a bridge going through the medieval city of Kilkenny. And one group of citizens on their Facebook page, they said, why is everybody protesting? Because our elected representatives took a vote, and they voted one way and we elected them. And on the other Facebook page, people were saying, well, democracy is about voice. It's about, well, nobody's listening to us. We're on the street and our elected representatives are not listening to us. So I think that's a tension in representation that needs to be thought about. We can't just stop at elections. But my question actually was, and sorry to hug the microphone, was to do with referendums and the point that we're making referendums as a tool for direct democracy. Usually in referendums you're given two choices, you're for or you're against it. My question is on multi-option referendums, preferential voting. People say, I went to vote but my option wasn't on the ballot paper. So I missed your talk, I'm sorry, on inclusiveness, but I'd just like your views on that. Thank you.
So if we start at the other end, and maybe if the answers could be as brief as possible, that would be very helpful. Do you want to answer anything, Roland? No?
Okay, just very quickly, I'll just address one question because there are others better qualified to answer the other ones. But is democracy dead in Ireland? I'm reminded of a vote that was held in relation to a bank rescue in the United States and the US Congress. David will probably remember this vote better than I do, but it was reversed overnight. The Congress voted one way today, and then they turned around and voted exactly the matter was brought before them again, and they voted the other way around. And nobody accused the US of not being a democracy on that particular event. I think if you adopt a particular means of taking decisions, you have to be open also to the possibility of changing your mind in relation to it. Now, I'd say in relation to the Nice referendum was mentioned and the Lisbon referendum, what took place there was somewhat in the nature of a dialogue, in the sense that we didn't get to vote on exactly the same thing again. In the first Nice referendum, referendum, in the second Nice referendum, we were presented with a slightly changed package in the sense that the National Parliament was legislatively given more powers, and also a constitutional guarantee in relation to neutrality was inserted into the Constitution. And in relation to the Lisbon, we were given reassurances which were later fulfilled, that protocols, binding treaty text in other words, would be adopted, giving the Irish people certain reassurances, and also that the size of the Commission would not be reduced. Both of those commitments were adhered to. In relation to as to whether Holland and France voted no to it and yet it went ahead, well, Luxembourg and Spain voted in favour of it. So no matter which way you went, if you like, the wishes of one set of electorates were going to be disrespected. That is true, but that doesn't go to the question of whether it's democratic to go against the wishes of two particular states. And no matter which way we did, we were going to go against the wishes of two particular states. So I think if we're going to proceed by way of referendums, we can't be too precious about it, while at the same time, obviously, referendum votes are serious matters and do have to be respected. Is Ireland a democracy? Is democracy dead in Ireland? No, it isn't dead. And I think exciting new developments like the Constitutional Convention for me and some recent referendums we have more or less proved the case that it isn't. I'm actually pretty happy with democracy in Ireland.
I'll just say in passing, I am too.
I was just going to comment on that as well, to bear in mind that, democracy in itself is a process, and it's been a dialectic process over thousands of years, and it is a struggle in many senses for many people, but not to forget the privilege that we have in exercising democratic votes in elections and the option to discuss direct democracy and referendums, and even in respect of the Scottish experience, the level of engagement from citizenships who genuinely felt it was the first time that they ever were going to have a say on a hugely important political issue, goes to demonstrate that the outcome was more legitimate in terms of the level of engagement at 85% of the vote in this idea of collective decision making. And just on the point of inclusivity, so the principles I discussed were deliberative democracy principles, one of which was inclusiveness and basically having those principles as part of the process in order to legitimise the outcome. And actually in the Scottish case, it was proposed to have multi-options, one of which was Devil Max, which was essentially what most people wanted, by the sounds of the way that the polls were going. So a kind of federal structure with Scotland remaining within the UK but having full sovereignty on all of its issues and more of a partnership in that sense. And the UK government vetoed that, and it was then proposed that they keep it as a two-option question, and so that's why there wasn't the multi-option. But I do agree, of course, there is also questions about whether or not that can confuse voters as well, because you actually have to provide even more information on what the third option is. It's just something to bear in mind as well.
The first question I don't answer, that's not up to me. The second one concerning the citizen assembly, assemblies are very good for discussion, but they are very bad for decision, because the freedom of everybody has to be protected. And when the baker has a totally different opinion than the majority of his consumers, he is afraid to say this. So you have to be protected when you decide, and you need also time before you decide to reflect. That's why I hate assemblies for the discussion, for the decision. But of course, you need people's assembly, many assemblies to discuss, but not to decide. So you can't replace the parliament, so to say. But you have to give the citizens a lot of rights to choose what they do with the parliamentary decisions. That's what Bruno said. It has to be always possible to bring any parliamentary decision to the people's vote. And not knowing if this happens is exactly what we want, because then the parliamentarians are sensitive and open and have to listen. The third question, when you want to have a stronger European Union with a stronger power where they need more power, you can only think this when you parallel give also more democracy in this European Union. The people will never be ready anymore to delegate any power when they don't have a balance also in a more to say. And that's why the treaty, you can say the integrative capacity of the treaties is exhausted. because the integrative capacity of democracy is much bigger than the hierarchical top-down structure. That's theoretically, that's the main point. And you have now a sequences of crises since 2008, all the time to say it will nearly explode our European Union. And the incapacity to even find a place to make compromises, this is also interesting, you know, because the structure does not allow you to make compromises. That's why now even the European institutions are sidelined and replaced by the two biggest bosses of the two biggest countries decide. This would be impossible in Switzerland, that two cantons, Zurich and Bern, decide, and they just they don't care about a federal government, a federal parliament. This is not possible. And be aware in the term of federal, you know. I think in Ireland you have too much also the American notion of federal. Federal in the European notion means that you have a decentralization system of power. That means only the things which have to be done on the European level have to go to the European level. But there on a better democratic base. Because the treaty logic of centralizing made yourself much more centralistic than whenever in Switzerland the federal level can only decide or make a law when the people and the cantons give them the power to do so. At the European Union level, they took it without asking because they said it's good for the market. And that's not possible. So we really have to think about a courageous change when we want to keep European Union together.
Yes, I mean, I think our whole discussion shows very much this feature that it's easy to agree on what we don't like, and it's much harder to agree on what we would like to do. And our whole political systems are very much based on that it's easy to say no to something, it's very hard to find out what we really want. And for this reason, the conversational features of a democracy are so crucial, because it's not just about checking and controlling and saying no, it's also to enabling good solutions together. And there can be many different ways. But obviously, direct democratic features by, for instance, being involved in the decision-making process, by having a right on the agenda-setting process, it's giving us, the citizens, so much of an incentive to be a little bit smarter, to be a little bit more informed, to be a little bit more interested in conversations with each another, which makes a fundamental difference to, let's say, a system where a minority through the political system creates a majority in parliament and makes all decisions. So, for instance, in my city in Sweden, we have said in an election every vote is counted, and in between we want to work for that every voice is heard. And this has deep implications when it comes to the setup of our democracy, and we have to work much more with that.
Very quick.
Paul Gistarossa triggered me to emphasize that I forgot something on my slide about the Swiss referendums. That is important also for the European discussion, because in Switzerland you need not a majority of people to have a law passed through referendum or a constitutional change. You count twice. You also count a majority of member states or cantons. And when we I think if we go towards a European constitution again, what should be done is it had to be approved by a European referendum, not a national referendum, a European referendum where a double majority is needed, a majority of people, but also majority of member states, with the option of those that don't support to opt out of it. I think that it would be the way forward.
Very last, very quick question, if you don't mind.
Quick, yeah, I'm a little bit skepticism about European direct. Oh, sorry, I'm Tobias Tyler. I work in the politics school here at UCD. I mean, one essential prerequisite of democracy is that the loser accepts the legitimacy of the outcome, right? So the loser accepts that the result is legitimate. You achieve that in two ways, right? One is some overarching sense of community or identity or belonging together, including deliberative capacity and solidarity and so on. And the second is cross-cutting cleavages in the sense that not always the same group loses, yeah? Switzerland has both, yeah? Switzerland has an overarching civic culture, and except on the Europe issue, where there was a relatively dangerous clear-cut division between the Germans always on one side and the French on the other, they're generally speaking varying majorities, right? Europe has neither, right? Europe doesn't have an overarching deliberative capacity, doesn't have an overarching identity, plus in all likelihood, though we don't know that, it wouldn't have, in certain instances, constantly changing majorities, right? So the British and the East Europeans, for example, would in all likelihood tend to be outvoted continuously on several issues. Now some people like Habermas say, well, that's not a problem, you just put the institutional structure in place and then the social culture will follow. But so far, certainly the experience with European Parliament elections hasn't been very good. So my advice would be try the European Parliament route first, and then at some stage, once that has worked out, go further and introduce direct elections.
Does anyone want to have a very quick... We are out of time now, so you want to give a quick response?
Yes, you make your case too easy, because Switzerland produced what you like today by direct democracy. Without direct democracy, they would not have this. And it's not true that the East Europeans are always collectively the same like the British. The interesting things, you have to go down, and then you see the different villages, the different regions. So what you don't have yet, you have to get, but you need the institutions to produce it. Otherwise, you don't get what you like to have as a condition. And when you wait until there is, without the institutions, you will never get them. But you kill the European Union. The people don't want to stay together anymore.
Thank you. And I hand the mic straight back to the organizer.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, listen, I suppose we've run out at, co-organizer actually, because of the other organizer here beside me on my left. Just to say thank you to everyone who's been involved. I know it's been a very short half day really, rather than a day, but I've been enormously impressed both by the quality of the contributions, if I may say so, and by the quality of the chairmanship as well. Thank you very much indeed, and the willingness of everyone to take part. So thank you very, very much for coming here on an awful day, and for taking part. And I hope that you have found it worthwhile. Thank you.